Well, thank you very much for that, and welcome to our short session on scaling carbon capture and removal. We've got a 25-minute session for you today, and we have an inspiring 5-minute keynote followed by a dynamic panel discussion with some distinguished guests. I'm delighted to be leading this session today during this exciting time for CCS. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Jarad Daniels, and I'm the relatively new CEO at the Global CCS Institute. Before I joined the Institute 3 months ago, I spent the majority of my career with the U.S. Department of Energy, working to advance all forms of carbon, clean energy technologies with a 20-year focus on CCS. I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Ilyas Khan. Ilyas Khan is the CEO of Cambridge Quantum, which he founded in 2014. His short bio is in your program, and in the interest of time, I will simply introduce Ilyas to provide his keynote remarks on the role of quantum computing to help fight climate change overall, with a specific look at how quantum computing can help advance carbon capture. Ilyas, the floor and our attention are yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jarad, and it's a pleasure to be here today. When I was listening to Jarad, there was an audio echo, and I don't know whether that same thing is with me. So I'm just going to pause for a second to ask if I need to change anything, or shall I continue, Jarad?
We all have the echo.
Okay, great. I shall continue. Well, not great, but I shall continue.
It's better now.
Yeah, so I guess it's a pleasure, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. And this very, very short introduction is not really about describing the problem. We all know the problem. What I'd like to do is suggest to you that there is a true paradigm shift, something that happens generationally. Sometimes it is a very rare event that makes intractable problems tractable. So the challenge, of course, is to reduce our carbon emission and to somehow find a way to sequester and safely manage these emissions. And in our opinion, this is a fundamental plank and pillar of the future. This has been a problem that has been around for a very long time, and it is truly intractable. It is very, very difficult. We think that the future is going to be made brighter and better because of the advent of quantum computing. I'm not going to describe quantum computers other than to say that this is a nation-state initiative. It's the first time that I'm aware that the United States has a congressional bill on a single technology. The first time. Japan, China, the United Kingdom, Germany, and many other countries have national quantum computing programs. In fact, Angela Merkel, a few months ago, said that the German economy and state depends on its existential well-being on the success of quantum technologies. Large organizations like Microsoft and Google have committed to this. So this is a global phenomenon. And I would suggest to you that in a period that is less than 10 years and more than 3, quantum technologies will add meaningfully to the challenges we face in the overall management of this wonderful and diverse and very precious planet of ours. Now, there are many ways in which that will be done. Nitrogen fixation, photovoltaic, optimization and efficiencies, battery technologies. But today I'm just going to quickly, in the next 3 minutes, focus on carbon capture. I would strongly encourage you to think about this because this is something which makes happen a previously intractable problem. I'm going to point very quickly to something which has been happening now for 2 years with Total. Total has a major commitment and 10% of its R&D budget is focused on carbon capture. They're looking at MOFs, metallic organic frameworks, and they've entered into a project which they believe and we believe will come up with a material that will permit them to do what they've been wanting to do for a very long time. And the way that this will happen is radically different. We will work at the molecular structure of a metallic organic framework based on aluminium and create the material that can do what previously could not be done. If there's nothing else you remember from this presentation, please remember this. It is very easy to shake our heads and say, oh, well, this is hard. But actually, what was hard becomes possible with new technologies, and quantum computing is one. I'm going to finish really by just mentioning 2 points from a timeline standpoint. There's a lot of information available on the internet for those who are interested. If you've not come across this, I strongly encourage you to do so. But Google have suggested, and this is Google, the organization, that by the end of 2029, early 2030, we will have a universal fault-tolerant quantum computer. The definition of that doesn't matter. What matters is that in 7 years' time, a computer that is capable of providing solutions to this problem, in the opinion of Google and many others, will be available. In fact, the number of qubits, which is a quantum bit, that is required to solve the nitrogen fixation problem, could well happen much earlier. I'm going to stop on that point. I think I'm 4.5 minutes in. So, Jarad, I've given you 30 seconds back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ilyas, and thank you for starting us off with that dynamic keynote. Hopefully our audio problems damp down here. And, you know, our keynote reminds us that our future is truly bright. Like many global challenges across society, solving our climate crisis requires a technology-enabled solution and global collaboration. And, you know, the future certainly holds much promise for continually improving technologies across humanity, including quantum computing's role and opportunity to advance CCS, as we just heard from Ilyas. So, however, even as our technologies continue to improve, we face our climate crisis today, and the urgent need for CCS deployment is abundantly clear. We have proven technologies that we can deploy now at scale globally, and especially in the Middle East. And this is what our next panel will discuss. How can we accelerate CCS deployment now with today's technologies to help combat climate change and help us reach our net zero goals? According to recent IEA analysis, CCS capacity must increase some 100-fold by 2050 to help achieve net zero emissions, requiring on the order of a $1 trillion US investment over the next 30 years. While this may sound daunting, it's achievable, provided we can find ways that government, industry, and the financial sector can all work efficiently and effectively together. Governments need to establish appropriate policies to support and drive investment in CCS. Industry is going to need to build, own, and operate CCS facilities at scale. And to enable widespread deployment, the financial sector must find ways to include CCS in their sustainable development investment portfolios and to enable finance support to flow to CCS projects like the world has seen successfully flow to wind and solar over this past decade. We must find ways to efficiently work together and get this done and springboard from our current set of large projects that are capturing on the order of 40 million metric tons per annum already around the globe today. So it's crystal clear we have to accelerate carbon capture and removal technologies now with today's technologies to reduce emissions and further drive down costs through learning by doing. The analysis says that we need both carbon capture and carbon removal to meet our goals. And so how can we best accelerate that in parallel? We know governments need to play a key role. So how can we speed up the creation of policy frameworks that support CCS? Which policies are most critical to unlock and enable investment to flow? And as we just heard from Ilyas, technologies will continue to improve. So what can we all do to work together to accelerate this technology advancement? These are the questions that our panel will now address. We have with us today Nick Cooper, who is currently Chief Executive Officer at Storegga and who brings much experience in the international upstream oil and gas sector and in corporate finance. Valérie Levkov, Senior Vice President for Africa, Middle East, and the Mediterranean from the International Division at Électricité de France, with a career spanning R&D and driving commercial deployment of new technologies. And Syrie Crouch, VP for Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage at Shell, with deep experience spanning from reservoir modeling and offshore work in the North Sea to managing the front-end development of a very successful Shell Quest project in Alberta, Canada. So in the interest of time, there's not going to be any opening remarks for our panelists. I'd like to dive right into the conversation. So let's start with our panel of thoughts on both carbon capture removal. What can we do to accelerate both? Perhaps we could start with Syrie and then turn to Nick and then to Valérie, and maybe 1 or 2 minutes each, please, to start the conversation. Syrie.
Yeah, so thank you, Jarad. And actually, for me, I think it's key. We need both, and you mentioned both. You mentioned about indeed storage, but actually removal. And actually, for me to look at this, then what I say we need is you need the scale. And scale is when you actually sit there and you move from looking at a single source to a single sink to starting to talk about CCS and as an industrial hub. And that is actually, if I have a catalyst to say this is a good location for CCS, then it's immediately starting to say, well, actually, now I can put that in place. What else can I do with it? How can I work with other industries? How can I move away from it just being a license to operate issue to actually starting to say, well, actually, what else can it enable? What else can it enable in terms of industrial decarbonisation, working with the hard to abate sectors? What else can it enable in terms of energy transition, things like blue hydrogen? But equally, then DAC and the carbon removals comes into play, because then you can sit there and say, well, actually, how can I do carbon removals either in the form of BECCS or indeed direct air capture, and actually allow them the synergies and to reduce the cost of those, both through excess heat, excess power that comes maybe from an industrial source, but actually to enable them to have a lower cost of sink by the fact they're utilising a sink that multiple elements are working on. And then lastly, for me, it is how do we move away from that subsidised world where we are currently to actually a market-driven world and a market-driven economy. And that's where you have to start getting the value for blue products or lower carbon products. And that comes with things like Article 6. It comes equally with things like net zero emissions targets for various companies or countries. And then you say, okay, there now has to be a value to that lower carbon product and therefore a price premium. And that then brings the market forces really into play.
Great. Well, thank you, Syrie, for those opening comments and for starting us off. Nick, do you want to pick up from there and add your thoughts to our discussion?
Thanks, Jarad. I mean, if I can pick up from Ilyas's point and where Syrie was, firstly, Ilyas said that it needs national scale initiatives. I think that's exactly right. And as Syrie said, we need to be thinking about creating clusters of activity here. We need to be thinking about scalable stores, which are, of course, the enabling function here, that are accessible to multiple emitters of very different types and flavors. And this is where governments can be helpful by providing clear financial frameworks, clear investment frameworks, and enabling emitters and investors in other elements of the value chain to assess the cost stack, assess the cost to capture, assess the cost to transport, and assess the cost to store, and compare that against the cost of doing nothing. And clearly, in parts of the world where there is a clear carbon price or a carbon tax benefit, you can start to get clarity as to where these things become economically rational, notwithstanding net zero objectives. Thankfully, for different reasons, in Norway, in the EU, in the UK, and in the US, with both a combination of carbon prices or taxes and tax credits in the US, we're starting to get that line of sight, and it's encouraging. But it does need that fiscal framework. It needs that ability for investors and participants in the chain from emitters all the way through to start to understand the cost stack and the risk reward. And then these things can really scale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, thank you for those thoughts, Nick. Valérie, do you have thoughts to add to this topic?
Yes, thank you. As being the last one, it's always difficult because everything has been almost said. But as an electricity company, of course, we need first, maybe to avoid or to reduce the emission. It's also part of the topic to bring solutions and to push everybody to avoid or to limit as much as possible carbon emissions. And then, of course, as you said, we need to build hubs for capture or for storage. We need scale. We need intensives it's key that governments support us with their policies to incentivize, subsidize also, because we are at the beginning of a new era. So, of course, solutions exist, but the cost of them need to be also subsidized. And as you said, also tax and pushing people and companies to reduce and to avoid need also to be tax oriented solutions. Of course, you need also being better in the solutions, and strong R&D hubs need to be established. If we all together pledge for those solutions and build those solutions, I'm sure it will be of great support for acceleration.
No, thank you for that, and we'll get to the to the R&D question here in a little bit. But first, I want to pull on the thread that we all just mentioned. It's clear that government policies are going to drive and enable CCS deployment, certainly until there's an effective market out there broadly in which CCS can get financial support. But it's also clear that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, right, in terms of policy measures or policy tools. And so I'd like to have the next question for our panelists to be, what are your thoughts in terms of key enabling policy frameworks globally, and perhaps with respect to the Middle East, if there's specific ideas in terms of policies that you think would be the most efficient or effective, or ones that should be strongly considered. And so for this, Nick, let's start with you first on this question, and then Valérie, turn to you, and then Syrie will end with you. So Nick, please, your thoughts.
So, Jarad, I would start with a supranational observation rather than a country-specific observation. I think that inevitably the logic of geography tells us that you're going to be seeing a proliferation very rapidly of cross-border carbon management chains. And so, therefore, the ability to relatively seamlessly move CO2 tons after capture across borders to common stores, which may be in an adjacent country or adjacent area, are going to be very important. At the moment, there's under maritime law, there's something called the London Protocol, which is being adjusted, and that needs to be fully embraced by both as an international standard, but also by the governments either end of these chains, such that CO2 can be moved appropriately across border, and these chains can be optimized.
Great, thank you. And Valérie, your thoughts on this topic?
On this topic, and I fully agree with what Nick just said, but maybe we could add also the fact that here in the Emirates, we are at the heart of the Middle East, and as we need scalable financing, we could have more, financing tools which are shared. We need also green bond markets to be established. Here in the region, we have large government funds here in the region that could support those initiatives. And maybe another point, which is a bit different, which is to higher the level of awareness of the stakeholders at all levels, because there are still a lot of room for awareness for the CCUS in the region. So financing and awareness may be my two words.
Those are good words to have in any CCS conversation. Thank you for adding your thoughts. Syrie, do you want to pick up on this thread and add some to the discussion?
Well, I'm going to say I now have Valérie's challenge from the last conversation, which is indeed the big points have been made. But actually, I couldn't agree more with both the cross-border element and actually that London Protocol cross-border conversation, absolutely critical, because if we're really going to decarbonize, then the countries who do not have immediate access to a store need to be able to store, but then there needs to be that reciprocal arrangement and conversation that the countries who are storing don't have all the liabilities moving forward. So that conversation for me is absolutely key. I think indeed this is somewhere again where the Middle East can play, because the Middle East has, they've also had, shall we say, a huge share of the world's hydrocarbon sources. That actually also means they've got the right geology for a huge share of potential sinks in that space. And so indeed, you can see that conversation coming about how do we potentially best utilize the countries with the greatest sink potential. I do think indeed the other one around the financing and getting the financial market up and running. Well, actually, to do that, I think equally governments can help promote this whole development and deployment of carbon intensity tracking systems. How do we actually show that something that we are asking value for as being a low carbon intense product is a low carbon intense product? To do that and to get the market really moving, then indeed we need a tracking system that you can track it right from its inception point or where that CO2 is stored through to yourself as the end user. And you can sit there and say, okay, I know I'm now buying something with a lower carbon intensity. So the whole thing here is how do we get that ISO kind of standard in this space really running? And that's another one for me to add on to both what Nick and Valérie had already mentioned.
Great. No, thank you, Syrie, for those thoughts. And I think all of us have mentioned these points. If it's clear, we need these global markets to be stood up in which CCS can then get financing to flow. And the devil is really in the details. This requires a lot of global collaboration and cooperation as well to stand these up. And so, it's clear that there is an absolutely crucial role for governments to play, but really government and industry, public and private sectors working together to move in these directions that we just heard from our panelists is again absolutely critical to advance CCS deployment, like we've been talking. Several of you brought up the topic in terms of working together and collaborating and supporting further technology improvement and advancement through R&D. Valérie, you already mentioned the need for further R&D. Ilyas gave us some great examples and insights in terms of where the technology that he's involved with may lead us going forward. And so perhaps we'll use our final minutes here just to get the panelists' thoughts in terms of what we may do to accelerate technology progress broadly for both carbon capture and carbon removal. Valérie, in the interest across all these questions, perhaps you could start off this round and then we'll go to Nick and Syrie, you get the last word here before we're going to have to wrap up. So Valérie, please, your thoughts on how we can work together to accelerate technology R&D.
In EDF, we have $700 million of R&D program yearly. So, of course, we invest in technology a lot. We started with carbon capture in our coal power plant in France in 2008. So 13 years ago. But there's still a lot to do. At that time, we captured 1 ton of CO2 per hour. And it has been great progress, but we still need not only for the power plant, but for our clients in cement, in a steel company, in aluminium. And you can have a lot of technical development around emission to e-methane or oxy-combustion. So very technical words, but the scope is so large that we absolutely need to bring all the big industries and utilities around the same table.
Great. No, thank you for that. Nick, your thoughts to add? Nope, you're on mute, Nick.
Sorry, should have learned that by now. If you look at CCS, the acronym, I think there are some areas where you'll get more advances than others. On the CC, the carbon capture, yes, you'll see technological improvements both on the carbon capture from concentrated CO2 streams up chimneys. But I think particularly with direct air capture, where you'll see hopefully a cost curve not dissimilar to that of offshore wind or solar in terms of its rollout at scale in the next decade. And that is much needed. On the storage side, there's not really much in the way of technology. Yes, there is a lot in terms of optimizing the stores, but actually the usage, it'll be more of a scale factor, I think, the unit cost for the storage. Utilization is where we need to be seeing a lot more. At the moment, all the possible utilizations of CO2 added up are still less than 1% of the total amount of CO2 that needs to be addressed. So a lot more needs to be done there because it seems to be very wasteful storing 99% of this product and treating it as waste. So there's got to be a lot of advantages in those two areas.
Great,
sorry,
thanks.
Syrie.
Yep, Syrie, go ahead.
I'm actually going to break it into very similar buckets. In terms of the capture, we're very active in the capture. Shell actually has its own means and things like that. And one of the challenges here is indeed we're dealing with a generation which is coming towards the end of its life, and it's actually looking at what are those next step changes, because this is where a lot of the cost is, and it's cost which, if we can come down that cost curve, then obviously it's cheaper for the large scale capture, but actually it also enables the smaller CO2 emission points to also be brought into the whole CCS element. And so there's a big step change coming there as we look at those next generation amines, which tends to be solid sorbents. That solid sorbent, actually, we think we can get about a 30% efficiency through and cost gain in that. And actually, that also eventually will play out also in the direct air capture potentially as we look at those next generation capture technologies. Scale, Nick mentioned scale. Actually, I think the scale is going to be a big bit in terms of the storage. How do we actually go from indeed a working system where we are storing, 1 million ton per annum to up to 5 million tons, I think is about the biggest we've got at the moment, to actually start talking about 10 million plus tons per annum going into a store. So there's a whole area there. And actually the other piece for me is reutilization of existing fields, reutilization of existing infrastructure. There's also the whole materials piece here to think through. In that sense, we're active in that. And indeed, the last point is indeed, as Nick mentioned, CO2 is a bit of a thermodynamic black hole. You've taken all the energy out of it. But actually, what does that then mean for how we can then utilize it going forward? And again, it's looking for those novel options. How can we use it to blend into cement and other key industrial processes that we want to look at going forward? All of which are a big part of an active research program.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Syrie, and thank you, all of our speakers. I think this is all the time we have for this section. It's absolutely clear we need to find ways to work together. The climate math shows that both carbon capture and carbon removable are required to meet our net zero goals. And I think all of us here on the panel and our keynote speaker look forward to working with all of you to help make this happen. So I'd like to thank our speakers for this session, and I'll now hand the program back to the conference host. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.